der Agile Focal Point Podcast mit Mike Leber und Harald Wild.
What a pleasure having Jim Highsmith today as our guest at the AFP podcast. No need to give a big introduction for Jim, probably because most people might know him from many different initiatives. And we just had a little conversation about the Apollo project where Jim was part of it. And maybe we can start with that. And that's been quite a long time ago. But Jim, in your latest book, Wild West to Agile, you wrote about this era too. You were there as an engineer, right?
Right. I graduated from college in electrical engineering in 1966, and I went to work for actually Pan American World Airways, had an aerospace division, and that aerospace division ran the missile site at Patrick Air Force Base. It's where they shot off a lot of the military rockets. And so I worked a little bit on the Apollo program, and specifically what I worked on, let me go back just a second. I mentioned Patrick Air Force Base. So one of the things that happened is in front of Patrick Air Force Base, the main building, there were a bunch of rockets that were of different kinds that had been used there it had been launched there. And one morning, a friend of mine and I walked into the office, and, we had white shirts and ties, thin ties, pocket protectors full of pins, typical engineer of the time. And we walked up to one of the rockets and started talking to each other. And then we started counting down 10, 9, 8, and ran. And the tourists took off in all directions.
That's a good one.
We never lived that one down. But anyway, in the early to mid 60s, the communications were not very good. And so there was some concern that they wouldn't be able to communicate with the spacecraft coming back as it came back in and landed in the Pacific. So they built 5 ships. And these ships were supposed to go out into the ocean, and they had miniature control centers just like in Houston. And they were going to track the spacecraft as they came back. So I worked on those ships. And it was really interesting. We had a militarized computer that they used on the Navy ships.
Right.
And it even had a battle switch on it. In case you were in a battle, it would run until it overheated.
Wow.
And we had 32-bit words or 36-bit words in 32K. So when I got out of engineering school, we designed transistor circuits with transistors about as big as the end of my finger.
Right.
Today, you can get 5 billion transistors on a chip. And that just is a little indication of where the technology has gone over that 60 years.
It's unbelievable, actually. And this is technology, right? But if we zoom into, and even, of course, the times were different. I mean, the context. I mean, military has been, I think, a big background for developing respective methods in project management, in software engineering, and so on and so forth. But you still, even given this endeavor, the Apollo program, you still had the same challenges, right? Communication.
Right.
And when I say communication, I don't only mean, computer to computer. It's like people.
Back during that period of time, when we were on base, the input to the computer was punch cards. When we were out at sea trials on the ship, the input-output was paper tape.
Yeah.
And we had a console that was about 3 or 4 columns and 6 or 8 rows. And every intersection was a button. And that button rolled one program out of the computer and the next one in. And you had acquisition software, you had tracking software, and I forget what the other ones were. But we had 2 types of radars. We had telemetry. We had a lot of different. We had a navigation system that was still secret because it was one that was used on the nuclear subs. And all of that information fed into this computer that was minuscule by today's standards. And writing the software for that, for example, the acquisition of the spacecraft was very difficult, and the ship had polarized light beams that they shot the length of the ship from one radar to the last radar, and that measured the flex of the ship, and that was ground into the calculations.
Amazing.
So it was quite a feat.
It reminds me a little bit on the rockets of how's Elon Musk's company called, SpaceX, right? How they land
SpaceX, right?
The rockets must have been the initial technology for this to make it possible.
Right. Well, let me tell you how the technology advanced. Another piece of technology.
Yeah.
They used to have, when they shot off like the Titan missiles,
right?
They used to have a range safety officer. They actually had two of them. One set perpendicular to the rocket and had a wire in a 2x4 frame, and the rocket was supposed to go up the wire and go this way, and not inland. And the other guys, the Air Force guys, sat behind the rocket, and it was supposed to go up the wire and go out like this. Well, they automated that function. And the first time they used it, the rocket went up, went the wrong way, and they blew it up.
Wow.
And then they came to find out the wires were crossed on the machine. And they had blown up a rocket that was actually going the right way.
That's an expensive mistake.
Yeah. The press of a button.
that exactly. And I think that brings us to this point. Of course, in the 60s, nobody talked about Agile. And the as you wrote and just described, the discipline of software engineering was a different one. It was different kind of organizations. But I mean, how could you have ran a program like a space program without being adaptive? So the question is, I mean, looking backwards, and I think you wrote about this in your book extensively, could you, in hindsight, recognize adaptive capabilities in these days, how the organizations were run, how these teams work together?
Well, one of the things that happened back then was you didn't have the different roles, or you basically you did everything yourself. You did the analysis, you did the design, you did the programming. Right. There were no guidelines. There were a few books about the different languages. So there was a Fortran book, there was a COBOL book, but we basically wrote in assembler language on the ships, and there wasn't much to go on, right, except other people's experience. And when I got to my next job, which was in business systems, you had punch cards in, and you had tape drive. I mean, you had printer out. And today, that would be like hitting a programmer hitting the enter key and having a 12-hour wait to get results. And so the ability to be agile was much, much less. The technology didn't really allow it, but you still were doing things iteratively because that was really the only way to do it back then. So there was a way that you could be somewhat iterative and learn, but we really didn't have the technology to make that a real way of working. It was really all seat of the pants.
Right. So was it like because you had to discover so many new things that you went that you had to use an iterative approach, because it's like inventing, then testing, then adapting, then inventing, then testing? Was that like a bit like an agile or iterative approach?
Yeah, it was. So, for example, for my master's degree project, I got a master's in business, Master of Science in Business. I developed a GPSS simulation model, and none of my professors knew the language. The only thing I had to go on was a book about the language that was wrong in a lot of different places. And so I was continually trying things out. And, on a slow turnaround, maybe I got a few turnarounds in an evening if I worked at the school computer center. And it was really learning, trying something new, reiterating, because there was no help in for that particular project. there was nobody, even a mentor, to help me because nobody else knew the language. And why I picked that, I don't remember, because it was a really tough project, but it was for a company there in Tampa where I went to school. And so it provided some benefit to the company.
Right. So, I mean, in your book, I think you literally write about 6 different eras, or is it
Four
different areas?
Four major areas and some sub
ones.
areas.
Exactly. Sorry for confusing that, and usually the one which has been, nearest to us is the one we remember best and might have been more proud about, but somehow, because we're just attached to it. Is there any of those where you feel closest to, where you feel like there was there was most learning for you, but also for generations, for society, and the biggest progress? Is there anything like that, if you compare them?
I think the primary thing was the evolution. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that I talk about is that the art of software development was really tightly connected to the technology of the time and the business needs of the time. So, for example, during the structured era in the 1980s, structured techniques came in as a way of understanding more about requirements and design. And so there were some different kinds of diagrams, and there was some different process. And we began to put some kind of process into place. And that was a period of time when all of the systems that we built were internal to companies. It was accounting, it was finance, it was payroll, it was manufacturing. And so you actually had a process in place that you could go and learn from and then automate it. As we moved into the next Agile era, a lot of the projects, a lot of the software was built for external customers, and we didn't have nearly as much to go on. And so there was a lot more exploration that was needed in that period of time because of the change in technology going from non-internet to internet era. And it caused a lot of issues, and you just couldn't do kind of a waterfall approach. You had to do more of a learning approach to get through those challenges.
Yeah. It reminds me, the speeches from Steve Jobs, who in his early days, saw the personal computer as the revolution, or how can I say, freedom of personal creativity. And I'm not sure how that was perceived on your side, where you were coming from, the more business related systems and organizations who got challenged, right, by the smaller units, which became more affordable, and then developers who had now access, because I think before it was like a privilege to get computer time at your university or anywhere and put your code or card in, and suddenly everybody could create. And that, you mentioned evolution before. To me, if I think about it, it feels more like a revolution. And I'm not sure if Agile was just an expression of this evolution at a later stage, because all of this started somewhere in the 70s. But
right, I think it was. And for example, that I wrote about the 90s, the 1990s, as really a period of the roots of Agile.
Right.
And that's when the technology was changing. So for example, I dabble in the stock market and have done so for 40 plus years. In the old days, I would call the broker, talk about the stock, place an order. Mm-hmm. He or she would input it into a terminal. It would execute. They would get a message back. They would call me and send me a paper receipt. All that changed in the mid-90s as the internet came around. And now I sit down at the computer and I order the stock, place an order, and get the response back fairly quickly. Cuts the broker out entirely, except as an advisor. So it's a very different role for investment advisors in that kind of environment. But it was a total shift, and we had a lot to learn in doing that shifting. The other thing that happened during that period of time is we went from character-based screens to GUI
exactly
graphic screens, and the Mac led that transition.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Windows came out.
Yeah.
And I remember using Windows 3.1, and it was a slug. But it ended up changing the technology. There were kind of three technology things in the 90s that changed. There was the internet, there was GUI interfaces, and there was object-oriented programming. And those three things were behind or helped drive the transition to Agile.
In your book, you mentioned the phrase "prepare for the future by learning from the past," and I would be interested in what do you think we did learn in that time frame, and what do you think we have missed to learn during that time?
Well, I think mostly we learned to tackle projects in a different way, because during the 80s and the early 90s, the whole emphasis was on big, what I call monumental methodologies, with lots of process, lots of documentation, lots of checkoffs, and they just weren't appropriate for a high learning environment that we got into as the internet era came upon us. And so I think what we learned is to do things a little bit differently. I think what we have not learned well enough yet as an industry is the difference between methodology and mindset. And that it's the mindset of learning and adapting that's really important. And some of us have gotten it and some of us haven't. And I use the term prescriptive agility, which is an oxymoron, and I shouldn't need to do that. But a lot of people practice that. And unfortunately, it is kind of in some ways a throwback to the 90s.
That gives me, I have to take a note, I think, because I never wrote it this way: command and control agility, or command and control agile. So do it or die, right?
That's right.
But we would love to at least, look a little bit at this whole Agile Manifesto thing, because again, I think we still learn from all of this, and you've been a co-author and one of the main authorities around this. And I'm not sure how often you've been already asked about this adaptive naming versus the agile naming. And I know Alistair, I think once mentioned, no, he can't remember there was anything like that at the table. But is it true? I mean, you had your book out, right? Adaptive Management already.
Right.
And then there was also a possibility to name this thing in 2001 adaptive. The Adaptive Manifesto would have been a possibility. It
could have been. One of the things we did is there about, as I remember, 15, 20 potential names on the board.
Right.
And we started eliminating some, and so the list got smaller. And adaptive was one of the ones up there. And I didn't want it to be adaptive because I didn't think it should reflect any of the individual methodologies, but it should be a term, an umbrella term for all. And so I actually was one of the ones that pulled adaptive off the board.
All right. Very humble. Very humble. And
truly,
I mean, of course, Agile is a thing today. I'm not sure what you think about. Before it was lightweight, and in your book you describe, I think Alistair, some others were not happy about, calling themselves a lightweight consultant. Although sometimes if we look at our bellies, we might be more happy in our later days about that. But more interesting, we've been talking a lot about, and this is an industrial thing, and I think your friend Martin Fowler once coined this term, agile industrial complex. I'm not sure how your relationship to this term looks like, but there is something, right, which is maybe different from, as you said before, the original core idea, which is maybe also about mindset. What do you think about this development, where this finally went to?
Well, I think it's inevitable. There's money to be made. And some people have made a lot of money off of Agile.
Yeah.
And there's different methodologies, there's different framework, there's different tools. By some measures, 70, 80% of the companies in the world do Agile. Right. Now, some of them may just wave at the name, and I always, excuse me, go back to Jerry Weinberg's law of raspberry jam, which is the further you spread it, the thinner it gets. And I think that's happened to the knowledge of Agile, which is it's been spread pretty thin if 80 or 90% of the people in the world are using it, or at least saying they're using it. So that it's gotten really thin in terms of the understanding and knowledge of both the methodologies and the mindset. And so I know there's been people who would like to say we need to rewrite the manifesto. Well, the manifesto was written at a particular point in time where the lightweight methodology community was very small. Now it's huge. Yeah. And there's some major limbs on the tree. There's Scrum, there's Safe, there's modern Agile, there's different kinds of limbs that have grown off of that tree. And what I would say is that there is something about the Agile Manifesto and the Agile movement as it gotten started that inspired passion in people. It was really a passionate response because it really hit people where they were back at that point in time. And so what I would like to see is us really think about what is it about Agile that is the core thing that needs to stay the same? And what are the extensions that might need to be made?
Yeah.
And so we don't throw everything out. We are not going to rewrite the manifesto.
Yeah.
I've been involved in several email exchanges over the last 10 years with the manifesto authors. There's no way you're getting them together again.
Yeah, that's another one. Which is fair enough.
You know, there's some of them that are pissed off at where it's gone. Yeah. There's some of them that are still trying. Yeah. You know, and looking, who today would listen to a bunch of old white guys rewriting manifesto? What we need to do is to get people involved and get back to the passion and get some younger people involved and people that have been doing this more recently and have a different outlook and maybe some of us can be involved in helping out or being advisors, but somebody needs to push this forward in terms of what I've called rejuvenating Agile.
Right.
Do you think, or what do you think is the reason that so many companies still think that it's a modern and new approach to get Agile, even though it's 20 years old, or the approaches started 20 years ago?
You know, things get dispersed in ways that sometimes are a lot slower than you think, and sometimes they're faster. I know major corporations that have big Agile initiatives that started in 2014, 2015, 2016. I got a call from somebody like in 2011 wanting to know about going out, doing this Agile thing. And I'm thinking, where have you guys been for the last 10 years? Now I can say, where have you guys been for the last 20 years?
Yeah.
But a lot of them are moving in that direction. And part of it is the technology. We've got another onslaught of technology that's about to hit us in terms of AI and quantum computing. Yeah. It's going to be some major changes. We've had some big technology changes in the mid 2000s when social media started and big data started, and that changed the environment too. I think long term, what we've got to do is focus on agility, not necessarily agile methodology, but the end result has got to be better agility for the businesses themselves. And so I think there's still some companies that are going to lag. That's always going to be that way. And there's some companies that are going to lead, and it's always going to be that way. And I just think that the laggards are going to drop off at a faster rate than they have in the past because they just won't be able to keep up with the magnitude of the changes.
That's an interesting point. And I think you mentioned the term business agility in your book. And you're probably also aware of this. This is a term which splits a little bit of the communities, or some are just saying, what is that here for? I mean, we're already talking at the core about this thing, and business agility, that's what they say, is just another blown up balloon, which doesn't add any additional value. And then some even say, and you're a native speaker, hey, agility and agile are both, the same kind of words. What's your stake on that?
Well, I think there are many ways to get to agility, and I think the people who are not proponents, if you will, of business agility don't understand the world we're living in, because it's not just projects and software and products that have to undergo this agility, but everybody complains about the fact that their middle and upper managers don't understand, right? That we would really be able to get Agile embedded in the company a lot better if our senior leaders understood what it was all about.
Right.
So if that's the case, then won't business agility or enterprise agility or some higher level organizational agility be a good thing, both for the business itself and for the digital transformation part of it? And so one of the things I've done recently is I know that there's been a lot of people in the Agile business community, business agility community, who have said, here's what management needs to do. Here's what they need to do. The C-level leaders need to do in order to be more agile. So they're saying, they're pushing this information up. They're saying, here's what you need to do to C-level executives. And I decided, I was reading a book recently from a CEO. And actually it was a woman, Jenny Romedy, who was the CEO of IBM for 8 years. Mm-hmm. And this book to me epitomized what a senior leader has to do to be agile. A lot of the things that she did were very oriented or very agility characteristics to me. Right. And so what I think we ought to do is we ought to do more learning from senior executives what they think agility is, as opposed to trying to tell them what we think agility is. So I'm kind of off at that direction.
Yeah. Thanks for this view. It totally resonates with me. I'm not sure about you, Harald, but I think we've discussed these things already also at length. And this idea of, if I was a software developer, maybe coming from this agile, community, and then tell somebody running a 10,000 people business or 100,000 people or more business, this is how you're gonna change it. It might be okay to say it because we've got social media, everybody can spread it out, but it might not be, substantial enough. And
well, it depends. It may be in social media, but the social media is not going to be looked at by C-level executives.
Yeah, that's right. But I don't want to blame anyone here. It's just, I think what I hear is business agility is just there is agile in its core, but there's a bigger game, right? Regarding business, running a business, and there are many aspects, and you mentioned some of them.
Well, if you think about the transition within the Agile community, and I set up 3 different periods of Agile. So the first period was the rogue team era, and that's when individual teams got to work on Agile, but it didn't penetrate the larger organization in most cases. And then the second era was kind of the courageous executives, when we started bringing Agile into IT organizations. And then the third era started in like 2010, 2011, when people started thinking about digital transformation of the whole business. Well, you don't have a digital agile transition of the whole business unless the business people know what you're doing and understand the mindset. And so there's a need for agility at the development level, at the project management level, at the middle management level, and the top level management level. But it's a little bit different at each level. It's just like I did a project in the 2005 year where we actually did a project that combined a hardware and software into a medical instrument. And so it was bringing agility to engineering as opposed to software engineering. And that was a challenge too. Right. So we're looking at agility in a number of different areas.
And you were mentioning mindset before, right? Mindset in terms of how we look at things, where we come from. That's how I think about mindset, how we build up our assumptions and then draw from them in order to have an easier life instead of every day to make new decisions. But when you mention these eras now, what do you think is missing potentially, when organizations just try to run one transformation after the other, but maybe don't look at some of the essential things? What could these essential things be? Because I'm not sure about your experience, but results might be average out of all these transformations.
Right. And the results are going to be, a spectrum of things,
Sure.
Curve. Some people are going to do it better. Some people are going to not do it as well.
Yeah.
And one of the things I got to do in the book is as I tried to reflect on the 60 years and the kinds of people, the kinds of characteristics that really determined whether somebody was going to be agile or not. And there's a lot of stuff that's written down, for example, about business agility. And if you read through some of this stuff, it sounds like good management. And so my question is, what's agile or adaptive about this? And the other part of my background is that I've always been an adventurous, both in taking on new jobs and also in outdoor stuff. So I've done mountain climbing and rock climbing and skiing and a number of different things, bike racing. And so when I started looking at the characteristics of good adaptive agile managers, one of the characteristics that I think they have to have is they have to be adventurous. Mm-hmm. They have to be able to risk. They have to be able to work on limited data. They've got to be willing to take that risk in an organizational context. And if you don't have people who are adventurous at every level, at the developer level, at the project management level, at the middle management level, if you don't have a certain number of people in your organization at each of those levels, at the top level, who are adventurous, who are willing to step out and do something different, your path to agility is going to be very limited.
What do you think about methodology? Is the core of agile, like being adaptive, being flexible, trying, inspect, and adapt? Is that what should be focused on more compared to the vast amount of methodologies that have developed over time, which are sometimes business models, sometimes serious approaches? Do you think a focus on the core of Agile would be a good idea nowadays?
I think it is. I don't have any trouble with methodologies because I've seen over the last 40 years, I've seen every methodology succeed, even the waterfall methodologies. I've built some really good systems using waterfall methodology. So I've seen everyone succeed and I've seen everyone fail. I've seen agile methodologies succeed and I've seen agile methodologies fail. So I don't think it's the methodology itself. I think it's the mindset you bring to it. If you look at a methodology as a prescription, that's not going to work very well. If you look at it as a guideline that you can adapt and use as you move forward, I think that's an important piece. The problem with prescriptive methodologies is they try to put everything in. So are we going to need X? Yeah, we might need X, so we'll put it in. We're going to need Y. Yes, it looks like Y is a pretty good thing. We'll put it in. Pretty soon they become so big and bloated, you don't know where to start. And you don't know where to take things out. Yeah. I would much rather an organization start with a small set of practices, a small methodology, and then what I call a generative methodology. You generate the need for things, and then you bring them in as you need them. So, for example, you don't bring DevOps in until you need DevOps, and then you generate the need for DevOps and you bring it in. But you don't start with these huge methodologies and try to take away from them, because what I found is it doesn't work. It's very difficult to slim down a huge methodology because you look at each individual piece and it says, oh, that's reasonable, that's reasonable, that's reasonable. And as a Scrum Master or a project manager, you want to be safe, right? You want to. Don't want to make any mistakes. And so if I leave this in, nobody can fault me. So this is take a strange example, risk management. Let's say I take risk management out. Well, if somebody could fault me if some kind of risk impacts that project or product. But if I bring all this risk management stuff in, it may be page after page after page of stuff you could do to manage risk. Well, that might be fine if you're building the software for the Webb telescope. But if you're building a computer game, maybe it's not fine. And so one of the things that I brought the analogy of mountain climbing to my adaptive software development book was that in mountain climbing, you have levels so that you know that, for example, going out and climbing something in the Cascades, like Mount Baker, is hugely different than climbing Mount Everest. Yeah. And so you have different, you need a certain set of skills and a certain set of abilities to do a particular mountain. And we don't seem to have that in projects or products. We think everybody can work on everything, and that's not necessarily the truth.
Is that, I mean, it's an interesting consideration. Didn't think about this before. A potential reference to something like CMMI, or would that again go way too far? Because we know CMMI again is a little bit more mechanical.
CMMI was big during the 90s. It was the era of big processes.
Right.
And the problem was that there were some good things about CMMI in terms of the learning it encouraged. But again, it was so large and it was intended for the military and aerospace that there was so much in it that people got lost. So I'll give you an example of why it didn't work so well. I was in India working with a company that was like CMM level 4. So they were really mature, good organization from a CMM process perspective. And they had a technical review of their architecture. And they had all the documents. They went through the process, and a little while later, the technology blew up on them. Because in that meeting to review the technology, they didn't have anybody who really had any experience with the technology. So they had the process, but they didn't have the skill.
Right.
And that's something you get because when you have those kinds of processes, management begins to believe that anybody can do that process.
Yeah. So that, again, coming back to your analogy with mountain or rock climbing, it's like you have to have it inside of yourself, right? You have to have experience. You probably learned the skill, but then you learn by experience, by doing it. And while you're doing it, you're not reading a book, but you're doing it from intuition and skill. Would that be the sort of analogy that we could transform into business and just say, hey, we need to get this intuition and skill together instead of running books?
Well, I think that experience is a big part of it. And I think, for example, a lot of what was in my book came from experience.
Right.
As well as thinking about what the kind of the concepts or theory behind it was. But a lot of it came from experience. So I would take that climbing experience, for example, and I would apply it to the next project that I worked on in terms of in mountaineering, you better be aware of the situation, be aware of the weather and the conditions to know whether you move forward or not. And sometimes backing off is the best idea because the conditions are wrong. In a project, so in climbing, you respond to the conditions, the reality at the time. In projects, it was you follow the plan in the old days, and everybody expects the plan to be right. And so reality, you just kind of ignore reality and follow the plan. Yeah. And so I think that's one of the differences that people have to understand.
So in a nutshell, it would be like you have to have a toolbox that is filled with high quality tools that you have to know theoretically, but most practically that you, as a company, that you have the toolbox. And if you need one tool, then you can use it, and then you should use it, and fill your own space of needs that you have with the respective tools that you have in your toolbox.
Well, I would say that you need a minimal toolbox and maximum talent. So you need to have the talent to do it. And the right talent can use a minimal set of tools. If they have great tools, that's even better. But they don't even need great tools to produce a good output. If you've got the right kind of talent and skills on the project. So I think that's what people are still not cognizant of enough, is having the skills and ability. Although talent is becoming a much greater focus of senior management than it used to be.
And I think most companies meet talent at least once in their lifetime, right? When they hire people, in the moment they bring people on board. But then a couple of things happen, which tells talent to bad word now, adapt and do what they're being told to. Right. So would that mean we need to pay more attention? And again, you mentioned it, from senior management leadership, to not only hire talent, but give them space, and even maybe, get some rebellion on board to say, I rather want to say naysayers than yes-sayers, and question what we've been doing so far and look after alternatives.
An example I had is years ago, I was a manager of software development for an organization. And I had a woman in the organization, and she was kind of different. She was nonconformist. She was adventuresome. And she got crossways with several people in the organization because of that. And she would come to me and she said, "Do I need to back off?" And I said, "No, you move forward. You're the catalyst that I need for change. So you keep doing what you want to do, and I'll back you up." And I think that's the kind of management support you've got to give to those people. It's not enough to have an adventurous person. You've got to give them the support from a management perspective. And that's why management needs to understand that particular perspective.
Yeah. In your book, you mentioned that your initial idea to write all of this down was actually to give something to your grandchildren. And so I'm curious, I don't know your family background, but I'd be curious, number one, what your grandchildren, said about this book. So what their response was, and even more, how are they, coming to you, talking about these things or understanding these things versus taking all of this for granted because it's a totally different generation, just saying, actually, we don't understand this whole history, why it's so complicated.
Well, it's interesting. The most points I ever made with my grandkids, and they're both teenagers now, one's 17 and one's 15. And the best points I ever made with them one time is we were talking, and my grandson was saying he had a YouTube channel. And I think he had something like 18 followers on the YouTube channel. And he was saying how, he thought that was pretty good. And I told him I had 12,000 followers on Twitter. And it just blew his mind. And I had to show him. He didn't believe me. But I had taken a memoir writing course 5 or 6 years ago. And I always kind of had in the back of my mind that I wanted to write a memoir for my grandkids and my kids to some extent too. And so I got about 2 years ago, I got started on this when, after COVID or during COVID, and I didn't have some other things to do. And the first thing I wrote was a section about 50 pages long on my outdoor adventures, my skiing, my hiking, my mountaineering, trips that I'd made. Yeah. And I packaged that up and gave them to that as section 1. And then I started working on, and they really enjoyed that. I had 50 pages of work and 54 pictures, old photos that I found. Yeah. And then I got started on a career, and I said to myself, the last thing I need is to do a resume type career. I worked here, I did this. And so I started looking at the different eras and how I might be able to fit that in. And the more I thought about that, the more I thought, well, maybe other people would be interested in this. And so I shipped out a really rough manuscript to 3 or 4 different friends. And they said, "Hey, this sounds like a pretty good idea." And it's interesting. I shared it with the publisher, with Pearson, with my editor there. And all I asked for was, did they think it was a good idea? And pretty soon I got back the response, yes, they thought it was a really good idea, and they would like to go ahead and publish the book. So I had a publishing contract pretty early on. And it's interesting how different books kind of transition.
Yeah.
My first book I worked on for about 5 years.
Yeah.
From first started working on it till it got published. This one, door to door, was like 15 months. Yeah, of course, I had full time to work on it too. I wasn't actually having to do anything else.
Yeah, but still amazing work. And I think, as Martin Fowler writes in the foreword of your book, it's so important to understand history in order to understand how we got from, two different stations, what brought us here, knowing a little bit more of context. And your grandchildren, like 15, 17, we already know there will be a lot involved with AI, right? Which is currently a little bit more of a buzz, but behind the scenes, it's, I think, a very, very serious business, which is growing.
And the one thing I'm really encouraging both of them, particularly my grandson, who is a big sports advocate, does play sports, and is also very good in the classroom, and he's tending towards the technology side. So I'm encouraging him to write. And in fact, he's the editor of the school newspaper next year. So I'm really encouraging his communication skills.
This is essential. So, I mean, the world has changed. The world is changing dramatically, and we don't know where it's going. I sometimes say, if we look at Star Trek and all these early, series, they might give us a lot of impressions what's going to happen next in the next decades, because people tend to copy, right? Somehow build after what they've seen in their youth. But the world also has changed in terms of, it's hard to get requirements from anyone to build a system and then, enter this process, because obviously we need to find more out by learning about the people, by observing and all of this. Now, here you have executives which are confronted with, okay, I've got my old organization, I've got my old platforms, here's this whole new thing, and then they talk about different methods. If you ran into any of these executives, what would be your advice? What to look after, or maybe not to look after?
Talk about some of the things that we've talked about, and the fact that they, one of the things about the Agile movement, to me, if you bring it back to its core, it's all about performance, building better software, building better products, building better outcomes, and people, building a better environment for people to work in. So collaborations, autonomy, self-directed teams, self-organizing teams. And there's always got to be a balance of those two things. And that's what the Agile movement is all about. So I start with executives with that basic framework. The world is changing, and we have less and less understanding of how it's going to change, more and more uncertainty. It's happening faster. And so you've got to balance your new strategies based on how do you get the performance you need, and how do you work with your people to build a better working environment. And those two kinds of things have really got to go together. And the more I read from senior executives, in terms of their books that I've read, they're really focused on that. Jeannie Romedy is really focused on that in her book, Good Power. And so there's a couple of other CEOs that I've read their books, and they're really focused on both of those things. If you really want to talk about an Agile manager, read the book on Phil Knight, Shoe Dog. That company was on the edge of bankruptcy so many times over the couple of decades. It's amazing they made it through. And his management style is really an interesting management style. Some people would call it non-management.
Yeah.
But I think it was a lot more than that.
Well, when it comes to incentive structures, especially in senior management and boards, where you have shareholders having their own interests, creating supervisory boards that create boards in companies, and then compared to the company itself or people working in the company trying to become more agile. What is your opinion on these incentive structures, and how do they influence the company when trying to become more agile?
Well, there's a trend in senior management or management that's going somewhat slowly, but it's still a movement in that direction, is to go from shareholder business to a stakeholder business. In other words, there's been over the last 10 or 20 years, a lot of emphasis on shareholders and that a company ought to be directed and driven by shareholder profitability. And there's another movement that started that's more widespread, has more involved. It says, no, there are various and sundry stakeholders. There's the stockholders, of course, but then there are the employees and they're the customers. And those stakeholders are extremely important to the long-term future of the company. And so, for example, if you remember Jeff Bezos at Amazon, he didn't worry about profits for a long time. He worked on getting the infrastructure in place and the people in place and to build out the kind of company he wanted. And he ignored shareholder earnings for many years, much to the chagrin of Wall Street for a number of those years. And so you can't always look at the short-term stockholder or shareholder view of the world. And I think we're moving probably much too slowly to the stakeholder view. And that's at the top level. And I think you need that stakeholder view in order to be more agile at the board and senior executive level. So that's getting into some real changes in how you view capitalism, which is way far away from program development.
Yeah. And there is this probably bigger context. I mean, we talk about climate change nowadays, right? Even with AI, there is already a lot of concerns about regulations and things. So I'm always thinking about this corporate social responsibility function, not just to say, hey, we deliver a product, profit, everything
right
in that direction counts, but seeing just a bigger picture, which obviously is complex, but at least to see more of the dots connected and not only within my little, scope. And that brings me to one of our final questions, because scope in terms of, if we look at regions, I think the US has been for a long time the dominator in terms of IT and innovation in that direction. The West Coast is still one of the leads, but China has grown faster than anyone would have probably hoped for or thought about. And these days, it even looks like taking more of a lead. I mean, if we in Europe, we feel like, hey, if at all, we're in the third place. How do you see that? Is there something companies, organizations should, change in terms of thinking and acting and running their business, maybe more global and anything like that? How do you see this Chinese speed of innovation and what's happening in the rest of the world?
Well, one of the things that I did as I was writing the final chapter of the book, chapter 9, is I started off thinking, maybe I'll try to predict some things based on my history. And then I thought, no, I don't think I'll do that. And I thought, what I want to do is I want to present the history to help prepare for the future and not try to predict the future. And if you look at the trends like the AI, quantum technology trends as an ongoing part of what's happened over the last 60 years, the question you really have to ask is there going to be a catastrophic, discontinuous change, or is it going to be an evolving trend like the rest of things? And I think it's going to accelerate change and impact in ways that we don't really understand. We didn't understand what social media was going to do in the early 2000s. I'm not sure we still understand what it's going to do.
Yeah.
But I think the same thing will happen with AI and quantum computing. It's going to change things in a way we really don't even understand yet. And the question is going to be, are one of the catastrophic events like climate change, geopolitical change, going to change things so drastically that all the kind of planning for the future is thrown out the door? And so I think that's one of the things we face today that we haven't faced in a while, probably until back into World War II. And I think people don't remember that, but the whole world was in turmoil.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people wondering, would we ever get out of it? And I'm not sure we're headed for that kind of turmoil, but we might be. Hopefully it'll be more of an intellectual turmoil than a war kind of turmoil.
Yeah, that brings us probably back to what you said before about talent, right? And we had this in a previous podcast. We probably could invest more into the education, like you mentioned your grandkids, into the education of our younger generations, because the more skilled they are, not only running a task, but skilled from a kind of philosophical point of view, the better for our society, right?
Right. There was a study that's just been published by McKinsey that talks about the difference between companies that go on a performance base and really are looking at things like stockholder value, as opposed to companies who have both a performance and a people focus, and that they actually do better, and that the difference in education between those two groups is enormous. The performance only, their training budget or their training is about 19%, and the or I'm sorry, 19 days a year, and for the performance and people group, it's like 74 days of training a year. And so there's a huge differentiate in how they look at their people and how they support their people in their organization. And so I asked myself the question, if more of the leaders of the world were like the leaders in New Zealand, Jacinta, who's just stepped down as prime minister, if there were more leaders in the world who were more like her in terms of looking at both performance and people, would we be better off? And I think we would. And that's why I think the Agile community has 20 plus years of working and trying to make people more agile, that we can contribute to the wider community.
Yeah. Is that something, I mean, unfortunately, this has usually a long-term effect, right? In terms of changing leadership, this might be a longer-term thing, but still, we shouldn't forget about it. Do you see, I mean, America, US is very famous for a lot of, business schools like Stanford, Harvard, MIT, and so on and so forth. Do you see changes there in terms of how they approach students, how they approach their programs, how they educate young professional leaders?
I don't really have any insight to that at this point. I haven't been involved in some of the universities for quite a while, so I really don't know.
Right. Okay. So it remains a hope.
I would be pontificating without knowledge, which I'm prone to do sometimes, but not on this.
Yeah, sure. So final one. I mean, we already talked about your grandchildren with the relation to your latest book and advice you might give an executive. Maybe we can wrap it up into this direction. What advice would you give a young student, maybe of the age of your older grandkid?
Well, one of the things that I'm telling them is that the change over their lifetime is going to be so great that they're not going to be able to put together a plan. If I tried to put together a plan when I was 20 years old, it would have gone out the window fairly quickly. But what I had, and in the early years, it wasn't explicit, it was implicit, was a purpose. And as I moved through my career, that purpose became clearer and clearer. And part of it had to do with the whole agile performance and people aspect. Part of it had to do with digital transformation. Part of it had to do with communication and getting the message out to people. So I had a set of things that transcended individual jobs and individual skills, but it was kind of a long-term purpose that evolved over time. So that's kind of one of the suggestions that I make in a book that you might want to think about. And it's something that I'm telling my grandkids. Don't try to plan, but try to come up with a purpose.
That sounds like a very nice, ambitious, and inviting,
very ambitious
set of ideas. And
and a perfect wrap up maybe for this podcast episode. And when it comes to myself, I'm into rockets, I'm into software development, and I'm into Agile. So I had 3 times the fun today, and I'm 3 times grateful for the insights you gave us. And it was such an honor to meet you. And thank you so much for taking the time for our podcast episode and giving everybody the insights into nearly 6 decades of knowledge. And thanks so much.
Well, thank you. I've really enjoyed it, and it's always nice to get good questions and different, every question is a little different, and I give a different response. So I talked about some things today that I haven't talked about in some of the other podcasts I've done, which has been really nice. And I realize that you have a different audience too. So it's been fun. I've enjoyed it.
Thanks, Jim, from my side too. And I think from everybody's side, thanks for the whole work you did throughout your lifetime. It's something valuable for everyone. And I think your latest book is just a recommendation to look into. We'll put it in the link of the episode description, and hope everybody enjoys it and learns as much as possible.
Right.
Just one question, just a final one. What's your next project?
Well, right now I'm working on several articles having to do with agility and management and leadership. And I'm also kind of kicking off a project. I'm not quite sure where to go with it yet, to talk about the rejuvenation of Agile. So I've been talking to some people about how can we kind of rejuvenate the passion of Agile in the early years.
Beautiful. So we will definitely, follow your work, follow what's coming out, what you're going to publish, and we're curious what's going to happen.
Great.
For today, thanks a lot for having been here. And all the best for the next steps, for the next mountain to climb.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Take care.
Take care.